means that they will need to close their doors, and that also means that their staff will no longer be able to turn up to work.
We'll continue to get really clear, early direction from the government. All information has been made available at Covid-19.
Basically, the goal is to ease the guidelines and open things up to very large sections.
So what is really going on with the COVID-19 situation? As distressing as the following is, it is important to look at this information objectively, especially if you're interested in making something good off this current crisis. At Property Magnets, our goal is not to entertain any conspiracy theories or give fuel to any misinformation campaigns that are rampant throughout the internet. Our focus is on helping our students understand the direction this COVID-19 crisis is taking and what it means from the perspective of crisis investing. First, let's take a look at Abby Martin's report from her Empire Files series. Abby is a journalist that garners a huge amount of respect from all of us here at Property Magnets. Abby has produced a brilliant story, connecting several important dots that point towards something very alarming.
We're in the midst of a global pandemic. Billions of people around the world are worrying about how they're going to survive it physically and economically, while the US empire sees it as a perfect opportunity to advance. This new reality exposes the great contradictions of the current world order. So-called enemies of the US, Cuba and China, are exporting hundreds of doctors and medical supplies, while the capitalist icon United States doles out death abroad and trails the world in caring for its own people. First claiming COVID-19 was being used as a Democratic Party hoax, now Trump boasts it'll be a great success if only 200,000 Americans die. Most Americans who don't know how they're going to pay rent can clearly see how the recent $2 trillion bailout prioritized corporations and billionaires, handing out billions of dollars for candy dynasties and cruise liners. But what's more hidden is how the US empire is using the pandemic outside of its borders, too. Long-standing US policy has left dozens of countries on the brink of collapse, making it near impossible to brace for the inevitable. Few more so than war-stricken Yemen, already suffering the world's worst humanitarian crisis from the 5-year-long US-Saudi bombing campaign. Since the assault began in 2015, there have been at least 120 attacks against medical facilities, crippling an already devastated medical infrastructure that couldn't deal with civilian casualties from war, let alone the outbreak of a deadly pandemic. But here, the US has also escalated amidst the crisis. Trump is moving forward with a drastic reduction of aid that would cut most of the support to the country's already battered health sector, including critical assistance to crowded camps and water and sanitation networks, places where COVID could spread rapidly in short periods. The bombing continues, too. On March 30th, the US-Saudi coalition launched 19 airstrikes on the capital city of Sana'a, killing at least one person. To further destroy this densely populated city, where most of the COVID response will take place, is criminal. It's hard to comprehend how any government could take such drastic measures to kill even more civilians at a time like this. While world leaders are calling for an international ceasefire, that hasn't stopped the US from dropping bombs. Since the virus outbreak, US drones fired down on a bus in Somalia in mid-March, killing 6 civilians, including the bus driver, a local farmer, and a 13-year-old boy. It won't be the last. US claims it has a small footprint in Africa are debunked by internal documents that reveal a staggering 29 bases. Since this is all top secret, it's hard to know what else will be taking place on the continent under the cover of COVID. The first COVID-19 case hit Afghanistan in February. Occupying US troops there have also tested positive. With decimated infrastructure, the Afghan Health Ministry estimates that at least 100,000 Afghans will die from the virus. It came as a relief then, when on February 29th, the Trump administration signed a surprise deal to end the war, and bring all troops home in about a year. After years of negotiations, the Taliban accepted this deal and a ceasefire began. But just hours after bragging of the talks, the US had resumed airstrikes on Taliban forces, once again ending the end of the war. And that's not all. Afghan sovereignty to the US government means they have to follow Washington's orders. As the combat drags on, the Afghan government is being punished for not pleasing the White House. On March 24, the Trump administration said it was cutting a massive $1 billion in aid, which will have a devastating impact on the nation's ability to brace for the health crisis. In Iraq, the US empire's other forever war, a new escalation is happening. On March 27, the New York Times published a secret Pentagon directive aimed at using the coronavirus to destroy so-called Iranian-backed militias. Killing Iranian-backed forces is just code for killing anti-US Iraqis. As the document states, some top officials have been pushing for aggressive new action against Iran and see an opportunity to destroy Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq, as leaders in Iran are distracted by the pandemic crisis in their country. The directive detailed a list of targets in Iraq to bomb, leaders to assassinate, and shockingly, included Iranian ships to attack. Even the top US commander in Iraq admitted it risks a full-blown war with Iran. While it's unclear if this is moving forward in its entirety, the plans have been drafted and have already been implemented to some degree. On March 13, the US bombed a wide variety of Iraqi targets. On March 14, it's believed that another Iranian general was killed in a US airstrike. The very act of reckless belligerence that put us on the precipice of war mere months ago. Additionally, while masses of Iraqis are protesting the occupation and the pending health crisis, the US decided now is a good time to send even more soldiers, deploying additional Patriot missile systems with hundreds of US troops to operate them. In the same imperial mission of oil dominance, US troops are still patrolling in Syria with the open intention to control the oil fields, today increasingly in combat in a war that was supposed to end. This is coupled with US-approved airstrikes on the Syrian state by its attack dog Israel, the latest on March 5th. The Syrian government has petitioned for an ease in sanctions to deal with the pandemic. But on March 17, the US responded saying they would tighten them instead. While the Iraqi and Syrian people bear the brunt of the empire's military destruction, justified by countering Iranian influence, the Iranian people are suffering casualties from a different kind of war. The 800 or so sanctions Trump imposed on Iran were already killing civilians from lack of medical supplies, and set the stage for the devastation they're now experiencing from the outbreak of Covid-19. Iran is the hardest hit country in the Middle East, surpassing 2,600 deaths as of March 29, with one person dying every 10 minutes. These crippling sanctions are causing an unquantifiable amount of unnecessary suffering and death. But the Trump administration has defied all pleas from the international community and even from Congress to ease them. Unthinkably, the US is adding even more.
We are announcing new sanctions on the regime. It's a kleptocracy. It's this Marxist, theocratic kleptocracy.
On March 26, the US imposed new sanctions that punish politicians who support removing US troops from Iraq, restrict the sale of Iranian oil, and even attack a charity that maintains holy sites. This scenario is exactly what sanctions are for. It's a dream come true for the imperialists. See, this is what you get when you don't play by our rules. They can blame the government for ineptitude, building a case for regime change on top of a growing pile of bodies. As Pompeo declared, the Wuhan virus is a killer, and the Iranian regime is an accomplice. Murderous sanctions are not the only act of aggression by the US empire in Iran. On March 13, 2 additional aircraft carriers were sent to patrol the Arabian Sea, the first time this has happened since 2012. the new naval mobilization expressly threatens military strikes on Iran. And on March 23rd, the US and United Arab Emirates publicized a full-scale mock invasion of Iran, actually constructing a fictional Iranian city for troops to conquer and destroy. The message of these operations is quite clear. While your nation is suffering and dying, we are taking another step towards war. In Venezuela, even bolder moves for regime change by the Trump admin. The democratically elected Maduro government has arguably taken the most pro-working class approach to the pandemic, with a 6-month rent freeze and outlawing layoffs. But in the face of US sanctions, they are still in crisis. Before the pandemic, US sanctions on food and medicine had directly killed over 40,000 Venezuelans, according to the Center for Economic and Policy Research. So on March 13, right after Venezuela got its first confirmed case of the coronavirus, the US imposed even more. These sanctions target the country's oil exports, the source of almost all of its income. In desperate need of help, Venezuela went to the IMF on March 18 for an emergency loan to prepare for what was on the horizon. The US made sure it was blocked, and the loan was denied. But maximizing physical and economic death in the nation wasn't enough for the US empire. So on March 26, Washington took their biggest move for regime change since the failed US coup attempt in January 2019. In essence, they placed a kidnapping bounty on the head of Maduro, offering $15 million for his arrest, with $10 million bounties on other top officials. This provides even more incentive for US-funded opposition forces to fulfill the dream of a coup from within. Ironically, the real narco states are the closest US allies, like the governments of Colombia and Honduras.
Nicolas Maduro must go. We must get this democracy started. We have now introduced this pathway to achieve that. We've made clear all along that Nicolas Maduro will never again govern Venezuela.
On March 31st, they published a transition plan where the US promised to lift all sanctions on Venezuela if the socialists leave office. To escalate the threat, Trump announced on April 1st he was doubling the amount of warships, aircraft, and special forces troops off Venezuela's coast. While the Pentagon is using this pandemic opportunity to beef up occupation forces throughout Latin America, those directed at Venezuela are a dangerous step towards war.
I would like to begin by announcing some important developments in our war against the Chinese virus. The impact of the Chinese virus on our nation's students. The Chinese virus. The Chinese virus. I talk about the Chinese virus, and I mean it.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why.
China, the country the US foreign policy establishment has declared the enemy and perpetrator of the deadly virus, has it mostly contained, and is now in the process of aiding other inflicted countries with supplies of desperately needed medical equipment, including millions of masks and thousands of ventilators and protective suits. In a time of much needed cooperation between the two countries, anti-China hawks are seizing the opportunity to push hardline policy against China, as well as anti-Chinese racism, key to war propaganda. Politicians like Tom Cotton are making the media rounds to assert COVID-19 is an engineered Chinese bioweapon. This unfounded conspiracy isn't just the ranting and raving from a lone senator. It seems to be a coordinated attempt on behalf of the same warmongering neocons that advocated the invasion of Iraq. Now, with the same premise, to confront China, allow international inspectors into your labs to disprove the claim. Furthermore, Matthew Pottinger, Trump's main architect of policy on China, is one of many turning up the economic war, advocating to sever ties, which will put even more strain on the medical supply chain into the US. It's not just war-hungry neocons, though. Corporate media outlets across the political spectrum continuously delegitimize China's aid delivery as propaganda efforts by the communist regime to, quote, curry favor with our allies. This all translates into much more. As the virus takes over, the U.S. is conducting mock battles with the Chinese Navy in the region as a threat. Just last week, the Navy launched live-fire missiles in the Philippine Sea. And throughout March, it's conducted regular military exercises in the South China Sea, something China has called a hegemonic act that violates international law and threatens peace and stability. The Pentagon sees open war with China as inevitable, not because it poses any threat to us, but because it poses a threat to capitalist profits. So this pandemic is being used as a golden opportunity to fast-track this new Cold War. Even U.S. allies are being put on notice as they struggle with the outbreak. Cuba's world-renowned doctors and their effective virus treatment are being requested by dozens of governments in desperate need of help. But the State Department has issued an official warning to not allow this aid that would no doubt save lives, simply because it would legitimize a government the U.S. is hell-bent on overthrowing. Taking advantage of the pandemic to further demonize Cuba and claim all their international solidarity as just a front for communist dictatorship is unconscionable regime change propaganda with deadly consequences. So far, at least 53 countries have joined the call for an international ceasefire so the world can band together to fight a common enemy, COVID-19. At a time where global cooperation has never been more urgent, countries are stepping up to show true international solidarity. But the U.S. empire has brazenly shown it will only weaponize the crisis, making disregard for life its official policy. Here at home, Americans anticipate the worst, left to suffer and die by their leaders in a corporate sacrifice zone. Rich politicians love to say that we're all in this together, but it's clear we are not. It's just those of us who were screwed by the corporate bailout and those abroad living under U.S. domination who are all truly in this together. One thing is for sure, there's no going back from this moment. This crisis exposes the true nature of our imperialist system. But that also means that together, we can turn our collective hopelessness into collective radicalization.
Before we jump to any conclusions, let us take a look at a recent report from Sky News in Australia. Besides the content of the report, what's more distressing is the lack of coverage of this report across other mainstream outlets. What Sky News has brought to the forefront isn't something anyone, anywhere can afford to ignore, be it Australia, New Zealand, or any other country that belongs to the Five Eyes Collective. So let's take a look at the report.
Well, now look, last week on this program we discussed an issue which has really stirred people up. As you know, we're witnessing interest rates heading towards zero. We raised here, and I don't think anyone else has talked about this, legislation before the Parliament, the Currency Restrictions on the Use of Cash Bill 2019. I mentioned last week I knew nothing about this till someone bailed me up at Melbourne Airport. Put simply, the legislation would ban the use of cash transactions over $10,000. Break the rules and you're in jail for 2 years. Break the rules and you're in jail for 2 years. The Senate inquiry into the legislation received nearly 3,000 submissions. The majority opposed the bill. The federal government says it's intended to fight the black economy by stamping out tax evasion. That doesn't justify legislation of this kind. And as I said before, if the tax system wasn't so ridiculously punitive, you wouldn't have to worry about tax evasion. But this is low-hanging fruit. If you want to do something, and Peter and I just talked about this before the break, about tax and who should pay what, as we've said many times, have a look at outfits like this Atlassian. And this bloke, Cannon Brooks, who seems to have an opinion on everything, and his company reportedly earns $1 billion in revenue, but is reportedly structured to pay no corporate tax in Australia. Nonetheless, legislation of this kind raises, in partnership with it, the issue of interest rates. The thing that is now worrying people is this issue of negative interest rates. At the moment, you put your money with the bank and they pay you interest. If interest rates go below zero, you would be paying the bank for the bank handling your money. This legislation would force you to stick your money in the bank. This legislation would force you to stick your money in the bank. Because of the dreadful returns currently available on bank deposits have been falling. Customers would rather hoard their money than stick it in the bank. But as we mentioned last week, according to the most current data available, as at February 28, total bank deposits in Australia were $2.12 trillion. So if your interest rates were negative, minus 0.25% on 2.1 trillion, you and I, would be paying the banks $5.3 billion just for them to hold our money. Here is a new concept we've got to get our heads around: negative interest rates. I mentioned last week that Matt Barry had written to me. He's the chief executive of freelancer.com. He alerted us to the International Monetary Fund and a recent report called Cashing In: How to Make Negative Interest Rates Work. Work for whom? Well, the response to the interview last week was one of real concern, and people said, let's do it again. It most probably gets worse. We have asked Matt Barry back, and he's joined us here. Good evening to you. Thank you for your time again. Are you aware, you're up to speed on this, where is this legislation currently?
Well, it's passed in the House of Representatives, and the Senate has passed it to a Senate inquiry, which has come back recommending it, even though the majority of the submissions provided by the general public and others have been against it. And I believe with Labor and Liberals supporting it, it's about to be passed.
Is there an agenda here? I mean, is there a definite move by the Reserve Bank to go into negative interest rates?
Well, yes. I mean, of all the central banks around the world, there's actually quite a number of major banks, more than just the five you mentioned, that are actually already in negative rates. I mean, the only 5 central banks around the world that are currently in positive are really the Five Eyes countries, so the US, the UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. The IMF report that came out said that central banks, to fight recessions, need to drop interest rates, or the policy rate, by between 3% and 6%. And with central banks pretty much near zero or at zero, in Australia at 0.5%, there's no room to move, and so there's no firepower left for the Reserve Bank to actually lower rates. And so the IMF came out and published this report in February of last year that said that we believe that you could actually go negative. In fact, not just negative 0.25%, as you point out, but
4%.
Negative 4%. But to do that, you need to do things like potentially ban cash or do other things to basically restrict the ability of people.
But just keep it simple for people out there. Is there a move from the International Monetary Fund behind the scenes, while we're worrying about coronavirus and bushfires and drought and God knows what, paying the bills, to eliminate cash?
Absolutely, and that's why there's been all sorts of talk about banning high denomination notes, and let's talk about money laundering and the need to be able to move to e-money and so forth. There's a general trend around this, and there's a lot of excuses that are provided. But at the end of the day, it's around running out of monetary policy, or the ability for central banks to actually manage the economy through interest rates.
So does that lead to? Sorry, Peter, just this one thing. Does that lead to? And you proposed this in a paper to the Senate inquiry, which I'm sure no one read. It's a very interesting reading. I congratulate you on it. But it's leading to something like a GST on cash.
Yes, the paper is actually quite interesting. There's about a dozen different measures they propose, and one measure they propose to reduce the use of cash is that when you go to the store and you pay with cash, that the GST would be higher than if you pay with, for example, tap and go or your card. Is that when you go to the store and you pay with cash, that the GST would be higher than if you pay with, for example, tap and go or your card. There's also proposals, for example, to put expiry dates on cash that you would draw from ATMs. So when the cash comes out of an ATM, there's an expiry date on it. So after a period of time, it's no longer legal tender. There's a range of things discussed in the paper.
Just on that, you said in your paper, you're talking about down the track, quote, a serial number lottery plan in which each year the central bank would pick a number between 0 and 9 out of a hat, and all bills with a serial number ending in that number would no longer be legal tender.
Correct. I mean, these are sorts of things that the academics are proposing around the world in various academic research institutions, and the IMF details them all in this paper on how you could potentially make negative interest rates work, and moving to a negative interest rate world, which the whole world seems to be doing right now. Because
to me, the Reserve Bank has moved at lightning speed to get these interest rates down to almost zero. It's unbelievable. I mean, for example, if the economy wasn't stimulated with interest rates at 2%, why the hell would you be moving to 1.5 or 0.5%? So the next step is, and there's talk about reducing interest rates, so if we get into negative interest rates, here we are paying the banks. Now, I think that out there for the public would be a real concern. Now, we could go on all night, but I want to ask you about something else. And Peter is in the same boat as me here. I mean, I knew nothing about any of this stuff until I was bailed up. Then I find out that in 2018, there were, for example, the phrase bailout, I think everyone viewing knows what bailout means. The government will bail out the banks. If the banks get into trouble, they'll bail you out. That's taxpayers' money. Well, there was a bail-in piece of legislation passed in 2018, only 8 senators in the House. It was passed on the voices, and bail-in means if down the track the banks get into trouble, they have access to the liquidation of your assets with the bank. Matt?
That's right. So it was Valentine's Day, actually, of 2018 that it passed in the Senate with only 8 senators present. Legislation that provides, in crisis times, if there's a bank failure, the ability for APRA to step in and take control of certain instruments that are with the bank in order to bail the bank in using depositors' money. So this is just like in Cyprus a little while ago, where everyone woke up and all of a sudden your bank account had less money in it because it was used to kind of bail out the bad debts.
That could be shares or bonds or notes.
Could it be cash in a bank account? Yeah,
it could be deposits. Well, so what on that day that you're talking about, what happened was one nation were negotiating with, as I understand it, with Matthias Cormann to exempt deposits. That is, your deposits at the bank from the provisions of this legislation. While they're talking to Matthias Cormann, 8 people in the Senate have passed the legislation.
Correct. So in New Zealand, the legislation specifically says they can use deposits to bail out the banks or bail in the banks. In Australia, it comes down to the legislation says for sure that they can use hybrid securities. Mm-hmm. So these are these fancy things they sell to retirees to get high yield.
Yes.
But it comes down to the definition of instrument under the in the legislation. It's not clearly defined. There's legal opinions that say that it does cover deposits and, for example, self-managed super funds and so forth. And so...
But in any event, it's appropriating someone's property. That's what you're getting at.
That's right.
Yes. So, you know, we pride ourselves on watching the Parliament. I did not appreciate this. It doesn't come on the back of, say, the GFC fight we had 10 years ago or like 20 years ago. What's the rationale? What's the argument for doing this, Matt?
You have 3 choices if a bank fails. You can either let it go insolvent and go under liquidation laws, or you can bail it out, as Alan points out, where the government comes in and uses taxpayers' money to bail it out, or you can bail it in by using depositors' funds.
But what was the prompt in 2018? Like, if they'd been putting this up in 2008 when the GFC was hitting us hard, I can understand the argument. Don't agree with it, but I can understand the timing. What was the motivation? Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister. What was the motivation in 2018?
Well, I can't talk to you to what Malcolm Turnbull's motivation was, but around the world, a whole range of countries were passing these laws, I think after the Cyprus incident and so forth. You've got to remember that in the global financial crisis, the Australian banks were insolvent because they rely upon foreign funding in order to actually conduct their operations. So the Australian banks were only kept alive by the deposit guarantee, which the federal government gave in and rented the AAA credit rating, and also liquidity operations where they provided $4 billion worth of cash on a daily basis to the banks.
And the other point here is that parliamentarians don't read legislation. Look, we're running out of time, but I'll just make one point, that on February 27, which is only a couple of days ago, Senator Malcolm Roberts from One Nation introduced a bill called Banking Amendment Deposits Bill 2020, which is effectively the same as the amendment that they were trying to get over when they were talking to Matthias Cormann, and it would stop this Act of 2018 from being used to bail in deposits, your money. So every one of you watching now should urge your MP to support this bill, which is being introduced into the Senate, the Banking Amendment Deposits Bill. Just a quick one before you go. Where's this heading?
Well, I mean, one thing I wanted to point out, which we haven't covered yet, is the fact that the Australian deposit guarantee only covers deposits up to $250,000, and above that, you're not guaranteed. If there's a failure, it's up to you. your own risk. Together with the cash ban, your money is trapped inside the banks now. To an extent. There's the ability for a future government, without having to go through formal legislation, to just make an amendment to include the $10,000 cash ban in to withdraw money from the bank itself. That could also be banned.
We don't know if the dots connect the way we think they do. However, anyone with a half-decent mind will be able to come to at least one conclusion. The situation is not good for the non-elites. The crisis is only going to deepen, and if there is to be an armed conflict as posited by Abiy, or if the currency restrictions on the use of cash bill will become part of legislation, then needless to say, most people are going to have to rethink their entire existence.